Now, for the opening address, I am delighted to introduce Sir John Armitt, who is Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission. Sir John will outline how an integrated multimodal transport strategy, underpinned by technology, could improve coordination and boost the economy. So, without any further ado, please let me introduce Sir John.
Oh, morning everyone, and it's good to join together for the inaugural Interchange Conference. The number of exhibitors and delegates that here is a testament to both your enthusiasm that I've seen so far this year for a return of interpersonal gatherings and the importance of this subject. Because let's face it, at the moment we have a problem in this country when it comes to cross-country transport strategy. We don't have one. And that matters because interurban transport, the connections between our towns and our cities, rather than the urban transport networks within each conurbation, is one of the key ways in which infrastructure can support regional economic growth and narrow disparities between different places. But before I get into that, let me briefly say a word about the Commission. We are the UK government's official independent advisors on long-term infrastructure strategy. Every 5 years, we produce a major report, the National Infrastructure Assessment, looking ahead for 30 years at the main priorities that need to be addressed to ensure that the UK is ready for the challenges and the opportunities of that timeframe. The first assessment was published in 2018 and heavily informed the government's National Infrastructure Strategy, with about 80% of our recommendations endorsed. We also published a range of other reports and analysis in between those main assessments. The Commission is currently developing analysis and recommendations for the second National Infrastructure Assessment to be published this autumn, setting out how economic infrastructure can help meet the three objectives of reducing regional economic disparities, reaching net zero, and, of course, boosting our climate resilience. Our work on interurban transport is part of that assessment. A couple of weeks ago, we published an interim report focusing particularly on roads, the headlines from which I'm going to briefly cover this morning. I probably don't need to spend long discussing the problems with our current approach to transport planning. At present, road and rail planning are in fact undertaken in silos, with no serious consideration of relative prioritisation between modes, or how to ensure that complementary interventions maximise the benefits of investment. Instead, we have overlapping spending periods within which projects are supposed to be delivered, with schemes assessed on a case-by-case basis, with little consideration of how individual projects add up to more than the sum of their parts. Indeed, the very fact that the Commission had to put out an interim report was to try and catch the RIS3 planning window, rather than wait until the autumn when we could present a more holistic analysis which includes rail as well. And that shows the deficiency of the current approach. So what are we proposing? Well, the NIC has called for a multimodal interurban transport strategy, built around a singular vision to drive economic opportunity, narrow the disparities between regions whilst protecting and enhancing the environment. This needs to be a long-term plan that includes a comprehensive response to decarbonisation obligations and is responsive to the opportunities of technological advance. If done properly, such a strategy could bring far greater coherence to the national road and rail programmes, enabling projects to progress with greater certainty and unlock significant trade benefits for business. That's the dream, and we know it's an ambitious dream. Developing such a strategy will require a huge amount of analysis and input from stakeholders, particularly the subnational transport bodies. In the meantime, we need to try and take some steps forward. We need to be honest about the current position and the realistic prospects for modal shift when it comes to longer distance travel. 82% of passenger journeys over 10 miles are currently made by car, and 77% of domestic freight is moved by road. Outside of congested urban areas, for many places, road is and will remain the most viable connectivity option available. So how do we ensure that the forthcoming road investment strategy, RIS3, is shaped by a tighter focus on what major roads do best in economic terms? That is, facilitating the flow of traffic in service and goods. And how can we ensure it also helps the shift to net zero transport? Taking the latter first, the Commission takes the view that the economic imperative to enable road enhancements is such that getting on with the electrification of the vehicle fleet is an overriding priority. As we put it in our recent report, the scale of action required to make road use sustainable is challenging but proportionate to the benefit that government wants to achieve for climate, health and nature. In terms of construction, that means National Highways must deliver on its commitment to decarbonise road building by 2040 at the latest. And we have to take all feasible measures to hasten the transition to electric vehicles by ensuring the rollout of all necessary charging infrastructure. Now, if that shift doesn't happen quickly enough, and at the moment it isn't, then government may be forced to look at demand management measures for the purpose of reducing carbon, like road tolls or road pricing measures. That may seem drastic, but we don't think that doing nothing about the state of the roads network is a viable option if we're going to be serious about boosting this country's productivity and levelling up between the regions. Roads have a vital role to play in that. So how can a new approach sharpen that economic impact? First, if we want to focus on the promotion of trade in services, it makes sense to look at the state of current links between large population centres. Meanwhile, supporting trade in goods requires understanding the movement patterns between key freight distribution nodes such as ports, airports, and the distribution hubs. We don't have time today for me to go into the detail of the analysis that the Commission has been doing to inform the first steps towards a multimodal transport strategy. But what we have done already is to develop maps which highlight those parts of the road network with potentially highest demand, and separately to identify where performance is currently relatively poor in terms of speed. I would say that from the off, any such analytical model has to be informed and illuminated by input from regional stakeholders, particularly the subnational transport bodies and the combined authorities. This is a key to ensuring that any future strategy reflects the future local economic opportunities rather than just the existing transport patterns. Visitors to the NAC may not be entirely surprised by what I'm about to say, but our initial mapping work shows that by looking at the highest theoretical demand based on population centres and freight nodes and current route speeds, east-west cross-country routes between the core motorway networks are routinely slower than the radial routes in and out of London. These links include routes like the A45 and the A605 between Northampton and Peterborough, and the A52, for example, between Grafham and Nottingham. Not surprisingly, of course, our work on rail has shown the same problems with east-west routes. We've also looked at the speed of direct links between our largest towns and cities by dividing the travel time between them by the straight line distance. Now, that isn't a perfect science and doesn't allow for things like large stretches of water or the effects of urban congestion. But as a ready reckoner, you can again may not be entirely surprised that we've identified the links between, for example, North Kent and Essex, Lincolnshire and the West Midlands, and around cities such as Reading as some of the slowest current connections. You can find those maps reflecting this initial analysis on our website. Now, I couldn't come along today without talking about the role of tech. We think that RIS3 and the equivalent rail investment periods of CP7 and CP8 needed to be tested against a range of plausible scenarios for the impact of disruptive tech. For instance, connected and autonomous vehicles could improve connectivity between places without significant upgrades to the road network, with cars operating at higher speeds more safely than with drivers. There are also potential capacity benefits for optimizing traffic patterns, particularly in better managing the activities of weaving and merging, which are significant factors in current motorway delays. The Commission is continuing to look at some of these issues and opportunities, but the key point for now is that our future plans for the road and rail networks have to be responsive to a future that may look considerably different to today. That means having a core pipeline of low regrets projects and a wider portfolio of developments and enhancements that can be refreshed every 5 years to ensure that the pipeline adapts to the rolling 30-year horizon. But whether they're road or rail, we also say that schemes committed for delivery should not be revisited once they proceed to an advanced stage of development, unless there has been a really significant change in the circumstances. The last thing I would like to touch on is the importance of good design, which the Commission has a particular interest through the work of our design group. This is a panel of architects, engineers, and other project professionals who are ignited by a shared belief in the transformative power of good design. In February 2020, the design group published the design principles for national infrastructure. Following endorsement from government, these 4 principles, climate, people, places, and value, should now guide the planning of major infrastructure projects in the UK, including, of course, road and rail. Government has also endorsed the design group's recommendation that infrastructure projects should appoint a board-level design champion to help ensure that schemes are built sustainably and to a high standard, looking beyond their core function to add wider value. If you want to hear more, then I'm pleased to say that our design group are hosting a roundtable discussion at midday today here in the main theatre, where their panellists will set out what we mean by embedding good design into infrastructure and how this relates to better outcomes. And tomorrow, within the TIP Live programme, the group will present some headlines from a recent series of events held in partnership with different institutions, including the ICE and the Major Projects Association. These have explored some of the practical challenges of utilising design principles and design champions, and have highlighted some important case studies. So, in closing, the Commission is looking to government to commit to a new multimodal transport strategy, which will create greater certainty, better economic outcomes overall, and in the meantime to ensure that RIS3 is better focused on improved potential trade links that are currently underperforming. As I've said, we know that this is just a start. But with the engagement and input of some of the agencies and industry partners representing here today at Interchange, I hope that we can build a consensus for a change in approach. So thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions, and indeed I know the design group will look forward to seeing you at their sessions later on in the programme. Thank you.
Very, very enlightening. Thank you very much. I know that you're on a tight schedule today, so we're going to keep it tight, but we appreciate your time this morning. Now, roads are actually having a bit of a hard time at the moment, aren't they? So, including cancelling the smart motorways over the weekend. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the cancelling of the future, not the existing smart motorways,
Can you use the mic?
Perhaps one of those.
There we go. It should be on. That should be on.
Can you hear me?
There we are.
Yep. Sorry. Well, I think that that debate's been running around for some time, hasn't it? And in fact, they've not cancelled the existing ones or the schemes which are almost complete. They're saying they won't build or develop any more in the future until they've got a much better understanding of how to be really effective. I think that's just a simple case of the reality of the politics and the deaths which have occurred where the scheme has not been as good as was originally designed. The distances between the points where people could pull off longer than was originally planned. So I can't say I'm that surprised. And it just demonstrates the reality of the fact that infrastructure is at the end of the day so dependent on politics.
Indeed, indeed. I was interested to read from the second National Infrastructure Assessment's baseline report that the view is building and improving roads and connectivity will accelerate growth. But the Commission's also previously noted that emissions from transport haven't been declining. So how confident is the Commission now that the UK will be able to meet its climate goals so these recommendations don't increase emissions?
That's a good question. It's a really valid question, I think. If we don't develop an infrastructure for electric vehicle charging, which enables us to treat that as conveniently as in fact we currently operate with our petrol and diesel vehicles, then it's not going to happen. I have not bought and I have not ordered an electric vehicle yet, and the reason I haven't is because where I live on the street, I don't have a drive, I don't have a garage, and therefore for me charging is not a sort of pretty prospect. And so I've, in fact, I have to confess, recently ordered another petrol vehicle in the hope that by that time that one needs changing. The infrastructure for electrical vehicles will be much better than it is. The debate will go on about hydrogen. Hydrogen is already being used in some vehicles. Some buses are now being used by hydrogen. JCB, as Steve mentioned earlier on, have actually got, of course, their own equipment which can now be driven by the combustion of hydrogen. So I think there are, for heavy freight, I think people are still going to debate that for a while, whether batteries are going to develop sufficiently quickly to reduce the weight that Steve mentioned, or whether in fact we're going to be dependent on hydrogen. But we have to crack it. And either we crack it through the sort of global use of improved batteries, or it finishes up as a combination of batteries and potentially hydrogen for some rail freight uses and for lorries. But technology moves at such a pace these days. I remain optimistic that in fact we will be able to crack it. But it is a race. It's a race against time. And the objectives are just around the corner. So we can't let up on this, and we cannot let up on the investment which is needed.
Finally, because I do know we are quite short of time, how confident is the Commission now that the UK will be able to meet its climate goals?
Well, the Commission produced a report only a few weeks ago which commented on the progress that government has made across a whole series of areas. And basically, we said, you are not going fast enough. You're not going to meet your goals unless you up the pace at which we are making all sorts of changes, both around climate and around our resilience to climate change. You all know in this room that major infrastructure takes anything from 10 to 15 years to deliver. We're launching a report today which tries to address some of the challenges around the planning system and why that is now taking 60% longer to get NSIP projects through the process than it did only 10 years ago. So there are some really big challenges, and these big challenges are not going to be met by simply having ambition. Ambition alone is not enough. We've actually got to have delivery programs in place. We've got to have key objectives, and we've got to measure our performance against those objectives, measure our performance, and drive along a very clear route of actual delivery programs, which you're all used to working to in this room. Ambition is lovely. It's words. We've got to have delivery programs to meet those ambitions, otherwise we'll fail.
So John, we're going to have to leave it there.